Hey everybody, it's me Baliang from COHEXPERTS. Today I'm going to be giving you my first help video for CoH2 and how to get better. And the topic for today is going to be the one that I'm asked about by far the most, which is just simply your general macro strategy. What this encompasses is going to basically be what units you should build depending on what situation you're in actually in the game. Now, I'm not going to talk specifics here, what unit goes best against what specific unit, and so I'm just going to talk about how you should consider your situation in the game and what that means to your tech order. I want to start off this discussion by saying something very specific, which is that your first three units, almost universally, are going to be predetermined. And what do I mean by that? I mean that these units are going to already be decided when you are on the loading screen. The factors you should consider for this are going to be what map you're playing on, what faction both you and the other player are playing against. For example, like OKW doesn't have particularly good light vehicle, anti-light vehicle options in the very beginning of the game, so perhaps you're more interested in getting a light vehicle out faster. But another factor is also the commanders that are available. Does that OKW player have the option of potentially getting a Panzer Fusilier? Well, that would provide them an AT capability. Those are just examples, but you should use all of those to consider what your first three units are going to be. But perhaps most importantly, I have one more, which is your preference. Perhaps something that's often overlooked as people want to talk about the importance of efficiency and what unit counters what unit. Until you get to the very upper levels, those things don't matter as much as your preference and how comfortable you are with those specific units and that specific strategy. So if you are playing to win, make sure you take your preference into account. Now I want to provide you an example here for what I mean by the first couple predetermined units. How about the Soviets? One example might be cons into another conscript into another conscript. That's a fairly standard predetermined Soviet build order. You're not going to have the intel on your opponent to know exactly what they're doing, with only a couple exceptions, to be able to influence your build order this early into the game, to be able to build something reactive to your opponent. Another example might be a Soviet combat engineer going into a tier 1 structure, into a penal, into an M3. That's another example. How about for the Wehrmacht? One example might be an MG42 into a grenadier squad, into a grenadier squad. The last example might be an MG42 into an assault grenadier, a commander-specific call-in unit, into another assault grenadier. Now, when we talk a little bit more about some of these topics coming up, we'll revisit these examples and we'll talk about how we determine what happens afterwards. What's important at this point for determining your selected strategy is how you plan to control the map, and then in reality, what happens for you to control that map. So I want to use this graph down here to try to make it so that you can formulate in your mind an idea of what strategy is more attractive than the other one. First, I want to point out the way this graph works is it's just two axes that show the map control of player 1 versus the map control of player 2. Any sort of movement for one player results in movement for another. So this blue line right here would represent 100% of the map both capped and connected for both of the players. Now perhaps one player controls 75% of the map and one player controls 25%. That would be represented by this point right here. Now what's important to consider when you mentally visualize how map control influences resource generation is that the bottom line for this is that player 1 is going to be benefiting no matter what happens as the point approaches the bottom right. Player 2 is going to benefit no matter what as the point approaches the upper left. Why is this? It's because player 1 likes when it moves to the right, which means he has gained more ground. Due to the nature of CoH2, this obviously means that player 2 has given up some ground. He also likes when it moves down. This is a cutoff of player 2. Any sort of situation where player 2, for example, let's say the map is split 50-50, that means it'd be represented by this point right here, and then we move the point down right here. That's visualizing a cutoff of player 2 from his resources. Player 2, of course, likes the exact opposite. A movement up means he got mapped. A movement to the left means he cut off player 1. So what does this mean for your build order after your first 3 predetermined units? Well, the important thing to know is that there's 2 major build strategies that you should consider in CoH2. One is going to be called, for our purposes, a manpower intensive build. This is going to be units such as AT guns, additional infantry squads, MGs, mortars or infantry support guns, etc. You get the idea. The other one is going to be tech-based build orders. This is going to be rushing to what are called shock units. Shock units are units that are defined as units that have the most impact the faster they can get onto the field, and then gradually might become less useful. For example, the T-70 and the 222 for the Soviets and the Wehrmacht respectively are the generally accepted strongest shock units between the 2 original factions. But depending on how many resources there are available, you could argue all the way to the point that the Tiger or the IS-2 can also be considered shock units if a player wants to rush those. But in general, tech-based strats are for these shock unit type strategies, or just in general for getting armor onto the field, maybe rocket artillery, etc. Let's go ahead and go over the pros and cons of these 2 strategies. Manpower strat. Its pros are pretty straightforward. The most obvious one is that your map control doesn't impact your ability to get these units. So for example, if you are using a manpower strat to get some sort of anti-tank capability, that means you're going to be building, for the Soviets and for the Wehrmacht, you're going to be building their tier 2 structure and building either a ZiS-3 field gun or a PaK anti-tank gun. Either way, it's a manpower only cost that all you have to do is wait long enough and you will be able to purchase it. Stalling games is a very common strategy that is very strong, particularly in CoH2 relative to CoH1 for this strategy. With a stalling strategy, you are going to be able to both see what your opponent uses his tech-based strat to get onto the field and build appropriately to be able to counter it, and additionally you're going to make it so that you can make the game take longer and deny him the win condition to be able to push you out of the game just because he had a good early game. Another thing to consider is that despite the fact that these units are manpower only, some of them scale very well. Consider Guards infantry for the Soviets. It's an all-around highly effective unit that with veterancy becomes even more effective, perhaps even as effective as a unit that would require teching to be able to get to. Although that is commander specific, it is just one example. Others exist. Some cons to this. Now these are very big cons, so you should consider them appropriately. They are more vulnerable, no doubt about it. These units can take significantly less damage than some tech-based units. And not only that, but since CoH2 follows a rock, paper, scissors sort of strategy, if you find that these units become vulnerable to a unit that specifically is that they are not specifically able to handle, you can incur heavy damage. Another thing to consider is also the fact that if you are basing your AT capability around several AT guns, if those AT guns are disabled, that means that you can potentially lose the game due to the fact that the enemy can take advantage of that. Something else that's very important to consider is that when using this strategy, you are mostly immobile. Like I was saying, rock, paper, scissors type situations mean that these units must work in close conjunction with each other. What that means is you can't go very far from your AT guns with your infantry, otherwise you're going to get picked off. You can't take your AT guns very far away from your infantry, otherwise infantry are going to counter them. That makes you relatively immobile on the map, meaning that this strategy has some difficulty winning games because it's hard to spread yourself out from one VP to the next and control at least 2 VPs with it. Also, no matter how you look at it, across almost all units in CoH2, it is resource inefficient. What that means is, for you to get an anti-tank capability using AT guns, such as PAC or ZIS-3, is going to cost you more manpower than it would for your opponent to, say, get a Panzer IV. The Panzer IV is cheaper, and it can do both anti-infantry and anti-tank to at least some reasonable efficiency, whereas you would need to get 2 to 3 times more resources invested in the different units to have the same efficiency on the field. Now let's talk about the tech-based strat. Tech-based strat, of course, is going to be the strat where you are going to emphasize teching and getting to more efficient units faster. So for example, as the Soviets, it might mean that you don't produce more units out of the tier 1 or tier 2 structures, if any. It will mean that you will build them exclusively to get to the next tech as fast as you can. For the Wehrmacht, it might mean that you don't even build the tech structure, you just research the next battle phase as fast as you can. This allows you to get more efficient units out onto the field faster and potentially be more resource efficient and overwhelm your opponent. The pros of this are little to no manpower bleed. And particularly when you are rushing an armored vehicle, if you take damage with it when you're fighting against infantry, so let's say you rushed a 222 armored car and you are fighting penal squads with it, you are going to be killing members of that penal squad that are going to cost 28 manpower apiece against your opponent. Whereas your vehicle will have to retreat and be repaired essentially for free. That is a significant advantage for you over your opponent due to the fact that they are limited by their manpower resource income to be able to field units, whereas you will continue to be able to overwhelm them by increasing the number of units you have due to the fact that you don't have to reinforce the damage sustained on your 222. The exact opposite of what we just mentioned in the cons for the manpower strat is you will have more mobility. Your units are going to be multi-role. They're going to be able to handle both infantry as well as tanks, at least to some degree, allowing them to travel further away from your units, allow you to spread out easier, allowing you to take advantage of the distance between his units far easier. By that same token, once again, the opposite of what we discussed on the previous slide is the fact that they're resource efficient, meaning they're multi-role. You don't need to invest so much to have some sort of capability across multiple unit types. And something that else I want you to consider is you can end games quickly, at least, compared to the manpower strat. Like the example I gave on the previous slide, if you take out an opponent's anti-tank guns when you have an a Panzer IV or a tank on the field, you can potentially rush it into their base and end the game right then and there. The cons of this strategy. Probably the most important one, and something that I'm sure you've all suffered on at least a couple situations, is that significant mistakes hurt more due to the fact that you have probably locked yourself into a corner of tech, and once you no longer have that vehicle, you have essentially thrown away the lead that you have. So if you rush a T-70 tank, for example, and you try to attack your opponent and you land on a teller mine, essentially losing that vehicle for nothing, it is a significant blow to your army composition, perhaps more than losing a guards infantry squad would be in terms of relative loss of map control. Something else to consider is your opponent can accurately switch their army composition to be more efficient. What I mean by this is, say you are a Wehrmacht player, you have a lot of fuel, and you rush in Battle Phase 3 and you build an Ostwind at an extremely fast pace. Your opponent is going to be able to see that you invested your resources in the Ostwind, and therefore he might avoid buying an M5 half-track. He can put his resources into an anti-tank capability, which he knows will be able to counter your Ostwind, while also continuing to save his resources, knowing that he would waste it on an M5. And that would allow him to get his tier 4 structure faster, just as an example, and get out a more efficient T-34 that can handle both your infantry threat as well as your Ostwind. So take that into consideration if you do not take more map control with your rushed unit. That means that your opponent can actually have a little bit of an easier time allocating his resources in his army composition. So where does that leave us with considering where we are in a game with this graph in the lower right hand side? Well, we already know that player 1 likes moving to the lower right, and player 2 likes moving to the upper left. In this situation, when player 1 likes moving to the bottom right, they're going to have more resources. And which of these strats is more efficient when you have the resources? That's of course going to be tech-based strat. So both of these players are going to like doing the tech-based strat more, no matter what. Because it's more efficient. That means that the further you as player 1 go into this corner, lower right hand corner, the more you should consider doing a tech-based strat. the closer that you get to the lower left, or the upper left, the more you should consider a manpower-based strat. So let's put that clearly. That means lower right equals tech-based, left or upper left equals manpower-based. Like I said, I didn't want to talk about specifics exactly, but as you are going through the game, you can consider it as simply as you like. Do I control both fuels? If you control both fuels in an equal or greater number of neutral points, no matter what, that puts you on the left side. Excuse me. That puts you on the right side of the dotted line. The dotted line representing a perfect 50-50 split among the resources capped and connected between player 1 and player 2. You should be able to therefore consider the fact that your tech-based strat is going to be more efficient, and that is what you should do with your resources. Of course, there is some risk to that. You have to consider several minutes into the future if you don't already have the resources. If you are committed to that strategy, but you don't yet have the resources, which due to timings is probably what you will do, you have to consider, of course, where you'll be on this graph in several minutes as well. If you are playing the game and you do not have control over your own fuel and might only have 2 or 3 neutral points on the map, that automatically, compared to your opponent, puts you on the left-hand side, which means you should automatically consider the manpower-based strategy as far more attractive. So let's look at some examples of this using those initial 3 units. Example 1 was Soviets with a straight conscript build order. Cons, cons, cons. Let's take the situation where your opponent has you significantly outcapped, putting you somewhere in this upper left quadrant. That is going to immediately indicate to you you need to do a manpower-based strat. What does that look like after your 3rd con? It probably means you're going to need a 4th con. For example, perhaps medics as another 250 manpower upgrade. That's going to make it so that manpower bleed con that we talked about for the manpower-based strat is mitigated to at least some degree. And it's for the Soviets, it's pretty much automatically going to mean that you're going to be going into the tier 2 structure and that you are going to be building units out of it, including the Maxim and or Ziz 3. Pretty much no matter what, due to the fact that those are the options, not including commanders, that the Soviets have for a manpower-based strat. They're the only ones, unless you consider PTRS penals as another option. Which, let's look at example 2. That would be your combat engineer into your tier 1 structure, into penals, into M3. What happens for your manpower-based strat here? Well, you can consider going additional penals, again, 300 manpower unit, something that falls into this strat, possibly medics at some point as well. But most importantly, for your anti-tank, you would probably be looking at the PTRS upgrade due to the fact that it's a munitions cost, but it is a little bit more riskier than a tier 2 based anti-tank build order due to the fact that it's munitions based, which requires you to have at least some map control. Therefore, another option might be going into a side tech, the tier 2, into Maxims and Ziz 3s. Alright, how about another example for the Soviets, but this time we're somewhere down here in this right-hand corner. Think you have capped your own fuel, no doubt about that, and you have over 50% of the game also controlled your opponent's fuel. Perhaps you have also cut them off once or twice. You might have 1 or 2 more neutral points than they do as well. That's going to make it so that you do the tech-based strat, essentially no matter what, because you want to get to those efficient units. You don't want to throw your lead away by making it so that your opponent can bleed you of manpower just as efficiently as you are bleeding him of manpower. You want to push your advantage. So what that means for this strategy right here is after you get the 3 conscripts out, perhaps you do another conscript squad just to maintain pressure. Perhaps you don't. Either way, once you get to the decision where you want to tech up, you might be looking at building the tier 1 structure or the tier 2 structure. But instead of building anything out of it, you immediately go to the tier 3 structure and you get out a quote-unquote shock unit such as the T-70. And then you run it around the map using its mobility, using its efficiency, using the fact that it doesn't bleed manpower to inflict damage on your opponent. In this particular example, tier 1 and tier 2 are both options because tier 1 actually techs you up a little bit faster than tier 2 does due to its reduced cost. But tier 2 is still a safe option due to the fact that if something goes wrong, you can avoid that significant con of the tech-based strat, which is that a significant mistake is even more significant. And this allows you to pull yourself back and still get manpower-based AT, effective manpower-based AT, should something go wrong. Another option might be getting tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, and then if you're looking really good, you can go all the way straight to tier 4 without getting a single unit out of any structure, straight into a multi-role shock unit, such as the T-34-76. How about an example number 2? It doesn't look significantly different. After penal and M3, once again, you might consider 1 or 2 more infantry squads just to keep the pressure based on your opponent. Since you already have tier 1 built, you can go directly into tier 3 and directly into a shock unit such as the T-70. Or once again, as we mentioned before, if your situation is particularly good, you could talk about getting to the most efficient multi-role unit that you can rush, a T-34-76. Etc. How about for the examples for the Wehrmacht that we mentioned in the beginning of the video? One of them was MG42 into Grins into another Grenadier squad. Now once again, let's start with the worst situation. Your opponent, you are in the upper left, your opponent has significantly more map control than you do. They have better fuel. That's going to put you into a manpower-based strategy. That means you're probably going to go into yet another Grin squad, perhaps even another one. But again, such a situation as this might put you into a bad manpower bleed situation. So that one's optional. Depends on the situation in terms of if you think your opponent's going to be going for a tank sooner or faster. Either way, they're going into a tech-based strategy and they are out-fueling you, if you will, which means your option for the manpower-based strategy, no matter what, is going to end up in tier 2, and then probably Pax and Panzer Grenadiers are your most efficient options there. Both manpower only, both inefficient for their costs, at least theoretically. How about the other example that we had? Example 2. This is a commander-specific one. MG42 into Assault Grenadiers something goes wrong, you have made a terrible decision with your assault grenadiers and bled heavily, and you don't have good map control, you got cut off, something like that, you might consider once again getting more infantry squads. Bottom line, you are most likely going to once again be in tier 2 structure because that's essentially your only option with manpower-based units only, and that's going to put you into Panzer Grenadiers and packs. Now while we're on this, let's talk about that con I talked about a little bit before, which is that they are immobile and they must be used closely together. Look at this situation that we're in here with the MG42, assault grenadiers or Panzer Grenadier for infantry, and packs for anti-tank. The MG42 cannot function alone. It will either get flanked or it will not be able to deliver enough damage to be able to defend itself. Assault Grenadiers and Panzer Grenadiers are both high DPS short-range units. Perhaps you are fighting against long-range units, which your opponent might build. Seeing these units onto the field, you will need the MG42 to support them to make it so that they're actually able to close the distance against the opponent. Your packs have no capability against infantry essentially whatsoever, which means if it is not co-located with your infantry squads or the MG42, it will lose to any infantry squad. So your packs depend on your infantry, and your infantry depend on your HMG, and your HMG depend on both of them. You get the idea. They all have to be used very closely together. As I write these tech-based strategies, consider how immobile these shock units would have to be. Let's say you go MG42, Grins, and you have your opponent's cut off and all your own resources, putting you into the bottom right-hand corner of the graph. You might go into more infantry squads, as we talked about before. You never know. If you have manpower but you don't quite have the fuel yet, but you know you have the advantage, you can consider more infantry squads. You don't build the tier 2 structure, and you go straight into battle phase 3, your tier 3 structure, and you rush out a quote-unquote shock unit, such as the Ostwind or Panzer IV. Now this unit, what necessarily, when you rush the unit, is an Ostwind or a Panzer IV relying on in your army composition to keep it safe? Probably a little bit is depending on Grenadiers for vision, maybe a mine and Pioneer for minesweeping duty, but it's still able to function on its own without those things. You can see how the efficiency is significantly higher. In this example on the right, the tech-based strategy, another tech-based strategy, possible with the first one as well, but just for the sake of argument, you've gone Assault Grenadier, MG42, you have a lot of the map, but you want to get your advantage out on the field as fast as you can. You don't want to go more infantry squads, you want it now. Perhaps you still go into battle phase 2, you get your tier 2 structure out, and then you go straight into 222s times however many you want. 888,926 of them. You get the idea. That's a joke. The 222 is going to allow you to bleed your opponent quite well. It's going to deny him the ability to use a light vehicle like an M3 half-track to harass your Panzerfaust-less assault grenadiers and or Panzer Grenadiers, etc. And from there, you can go into manpower-only strats. If something goes wrong and you lose your 222s too easily, that would be like more MG42s and packs. Or if everything goes right, you can still easily go into tier 3 into your Ostwind P4, or possibly all the way into tier 4 Tiger if you are mechanized assault, that sort of thing. That's really about it I had for this video, guys. Stay tuned. I am going to upload examples of replays where we see players correctly use this idea correctly choose their build order and are able to win their games because of it. And we are also going to upload examples of replays where you see players who don't realize what their map control situation looks like and therefore lose their games because they don't understand what units they need to be building in that situation. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Please, any feedback whatsoever would be appreciated. I want to do more of these videos in the future. Also, feel free to shoot me ideas for future videos as well. Thanks, you guys. See you around.